Hello everybody, my name is Zeke. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the 9 books that I read in July. It's kind of a weird mix, I'd say, and I feel like I say that every month, but especially this month, I have 9 books, as I said, and 2 of them were rereads. A bunch of them were books that I just picked up not knowing anything about them, and then some of them were books that had been on my radar for absolutely years, and I had been waiting so long to get to them, and I finally did. And just like the actual books I was reading were varied, the way I felt about them was very varied as well. I had some books that I absolutely loved and a lot that were kind of disappointing, but we'll get to that. Even though there were some books that I ended up being a little more disappointed in, nothing was absolutely horrible. Most of the disappointment was just from books that I was expecting to be absolutely incredible, and then they ended up just being okay. But overall, successful. I'm happy I was able to read so much, and hoping that this reading surge that I've had recently can continue into the next month and into the future. So the first book I read this month, I actually didn't read like a single book the first half of the month because I was really busy, and then I finally picked this up kind of on a whim, and that's The Chrysalids by John Wyndham. I picked this up solely because in the bookstore where it was being sold, there was like a suggested blurb from someone who worked at the bookstore, and it mentioned Octavia Butler, who, if you can't tell, I really like. So because I picked this up on a whim, I didn't really know anything going into it, but based on that Octavia Butler mention, I assumed I'd be getting some sort of speculative fiction story with some kind of darker themes. And I did absolutely get that, and I ended up really loving this book. Basically, we follow this small village that is really ingrained with this religious fundamentalism that is based in Christianity, but also has elements that are related to the circumstances of this kind of dystopian world we're in, where the people in this village and presumably in the wider world are very afraid of mutants who live out in the world, and there's this whole doctrine about otherness, and anyone who isn't born exactly in God's image with 5 fingers, 5 toes, stuff like that, is deemed to be very dangerous and really sinful, and it's from that base that we follow the story of this one boy, and then we widen out to a group of people who exhibit a version of otherness that is harder to see, and I won't go beyond that because I don't want to get too far into spoiler territory. But basically, as the book goes on, there's an inciting incident that kind of changes the whole circumstance of this village, and also this main character whose father is very much ingrained within this religious fundamentalism that permeates through the community. And so we kind of branch out from there, and we're exposed to this idea of otherness in actuality, and we kind of contrast that with this vision of it we get when we're back in the village. And I think what I really liked about this is I think there are elements of it that are kind of predictable once you kind of grasp onto what the book is trying to say and the beginnings of the plot. I feel like you can kind of infer where we're going, and I think that could have made it not super exciting to read. But I think, first of all, the world is so interesting, and we kind of find out why the world is in the dystopian state that it's in over time. And I think it's just an interesting exploration of something that feels very real, and not like it could happen exactly, but it's kind of based in something we're all very familiar with. And once again, I won't go too far into spoilers because I think kind of figuring that out on your own is part of what makes the book really enjoyable to read. But so that like very like real world basis, and then also I absolutely love the ending because there's a lot of ambiguity there, and it kind of questions the idea of utopia, and can we really have a utopian world, and what does that leave out and what does that exclude. And I don't know, it was able to explore that theme, and also the theme of otherness and religious fundamentalism that permeate through the whole book very well, especially in such a short book. And this was written in the 1950s, so I was pretty shocked by this. I thought it was really good, and I really enjoyed reading it. I gave it 4.5 stars. It wasn't absolutely perfect. I think what would have made it even better for me is some of the characters I wanted a little more from, but I really enjoyed inhabiting this world for a little while, and the plot was very engaging and really well done and really good at executing the conversations that it ended up executing. So switching it up completely, next, instead of reading a book that I knew nothing about, I decided to reread a book for the third time, and that's Played As It Lays by Joan Didion, which is one of my favorite books, if not my favorite book. I hesitate to call anything my favorite book because I love a lot of books, but this is definitely up there. So I think this book is impossible to describe in a way that truly explains both what it is and what it means to me, and I've tried many times. Basically, we're following this woman named Mariah, and she is going through basically an awful time. She has a daughter who's been put away in some sort of hospital where she can't really get to her or spend as much time with her as she wants to. She's struggling with a divorce from her husband, who she was very engaged with, not just like emotionally, but also professionally, with her being in some of the movies that he produced. And so they have that kind of relationship as well that kind of complicates things or complicated things in their like personal relationship. And then also the other men in her life who she goes to for comfort, but also not really comfort, because she's never really comforted in this book. And then the other people who surround her life, so friends of hers that are also friends with her ex-husband, who she still has a complicated relationship with. So as you may be able to tell, there's a lot going on, but we really are centered on this one woman's story and every awful thing that happens to her throughout this book. What Joan Didion does so well in this book is, first of all, I feel like we understand this character so well, based on just the writing, how she's written, and also how Joan Didion weaves through these different timelines and these different events in a certain way. It's not chronological. We're flipping back and forth. We go into her past. She reflects on her past, and in doing all of this kind of build up, it really builds up her character too and her motivations, and she's driven by kind of a confused nihilism. It feels almost like she's trapped almost, because yes, she's very nihilistic, but at least to me, it always feels like there's something under the surface that's kind of trying to fight that, and it comes out very rarely, and it does come out in not the best ways, but I just think she's such a fascinating character. And also the ending of this book, I think, is absolutely insane. And especially on reread, it's a twist. Yeah, it is a twist. It's not a twist in the traditional sense, I don't think, but there's something that happens at the end of this book that is very shocking. And I think that, especially on reread, you kind of see how that develops even more. And I just think that this is a book that there's so much that I can get out of it every time I reread it, because there's so much going on, and I just appreciate it so much. And I really don't think I can ever do it justice describing it, because it's a weird book. It's not easy to categorize. It's not easy to give a basic summary of, but I think that's part of what makes it so special. Next book I'm going to talk about is something I was very excited for, and that was Assassin of Reality by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko. This is the second book. It's confusing, the chronology, and I think it's part of two different series technically, but in my mind, the second book to a series starting with Vita Nostra that this husband and wife duo wrote and was translated into English, or is slowly being translated into English. I get very confused with all of that. I've trolled all of the forums to kind of figure out what's going on, and I still don't really understand. But as of now, there's two books, Vita Nostra and the second book that was translated and released last year. And ever since it came out, I've been trying to read it or planning on reading it, because I read Vita Nostra 2 years ago probably at this point and really loved it. But I finally got around to this, and it was okay. Since it's the second book, I'll kind of talk about Vita Nostra and the series as a whole instead of the plot of this book, because I wouldn't want to spoil anything. But basically, this is a very unique and interesting world where there's this school that teaches people to become grammatical concepts. It's as weird as it sounds. And in this first book, we're following this girl who's kind of planning on graduating high school, going into a college degree program, when all of a sudden her life is basically upended by the appearance of this strange man who she like sees following her around, and kind of tells her she has to come to this magic school or else bad things will happen. And she's basically coerced forcibly into the school, and it's like a hellish experience. It's awful. She doesn't want to be there, and there's weird stuff going on all around her. There's weird stuff going on with the older students that kind of alarms everyone going on, and we are very confused along with her. And so the first book is kind of a confusing experience, but we're learning alongside her. It feels very manageable, and I really loved it because it is so unique, and it has these very dark undertones that I think make it really fun in a way, even though it's like scary in a lot of ways too. But there's something that happens at the end of the first book that's kind of a cliffhanger, and then going into this book, we're also kind of still in the dark about everything that's going on, or we understand more, but it's still an incredibly confusing world, at least it is for me. And I think it's just part of the fun of these books is kind of figuring things out as you go around, and things slowly starting to make sense over time. But in the second book, I feel like we just kind of went off the deep end with the crazy, nonsensical magic stuff, because I was really struggling, especially as the book got on and there were more and more things introduced. I felt like I was just like missing a lot of the story and a lot of what was happening. I didn't really understand why it was happening or what it really meant. And then the ending, it's kind of also like built on all this magical stuff that I didn't really understand at that point, and it felt like it was supposed to be this like really powerful moment, but to me, because I was like, what is going on, I was kind of lost, and it didn't really hit me as hard as I think it could have. And so I don't know, I think this is still a world that I find really interesting, and I do enjoy following this character's story. And I don't even know if there's going to be any more books, because that's another thing I'm confused about. It might be, I think one of the authors passed away, so I'm kind of confused if there are any more books that are going to be translated at all. So if that's the case, then I can just be done and not think about it anymore. But I really have to think if there is another book if I want to continue, because this second book I feel like just like did not live up to the promise of the first book, in my opinion, and kind of let me down, just because I feel like we got less of like this character exploring this dark world and more, well, we still got that, but we got it in a way more confusing way that I think just didn't hit me the same way the first book did. But that might just be me being stupid and not able to understand whatever was going on. So I don't know. But I also think just generally this book is liked a little less than the first one, and I completely agree with that. Next, this one really hurt. This is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell by Susanna Clarke. Which I ended up giving 3 stars, which for a book of this length, if I'm gonna give it 3 stars, I'm a little let down, because this is like 800 pages long, and it was a slog for me. I was excited for this because a few years ago I read Piranesi, which is like her only other published book. She has one more like short stories, but only other like full-length novel is a lot shorter than this, and I absolutely love that book. And so I've really been looking to get into this book forever, because this is, I think, what she's most known for. This came out like early 2000s. So actually talking about what this book is about, we're basically following these 2 characters, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell, who are the only 2 magicians in England, and there was this prophecy about them bringing back English magic, and that's like a very basic summary of not even necessarily where we start from, but where I think the book really picks up. And then we get 800 pages of a lot of different things, but also it feels very samey to me when I like reflect on it. This book, what makes it so interesting is that it's really grounded in Old English literature, not Old English, but like 18th century, 19th century English literature, which is when this book takes place. And so it feels like it comes from that time. There's lots of footnotes. The way the book is written, the way we like slowly build up the plot is very reminiscent of that time period, and I think that adds a lot of charm to it. It's really fun to read in a lot of ways because you kind of see what she's doing, and she's very, very grounded in this historical influence. There's a lot of actual history that takes place during this book that is just reflected onto this magical world, and it's kind of a reinterpretation of that history through this lens of these two magicians and everything they're doing at this time. And like that part, it's very interesting, but I think for me, I just felt this layer of separation between me and this book for whatever reason. I didn't care that much for the characters, and I think that was like the first thing that really made me like lose interest in this book. But also, I just think the actual plot for me didn't do much. I think it's very, very slow moving, and even like usually if a book is slow, I don't really care because where we end up, it makes me feel like it was all worth it. And for this, once we get to the end, I was kind of just like, okay, like I didn't have any strong opinions on it. But once again, I think there's a lot of charm to this book. I think a lot of people really love this book because of that, and there is a lot to like in this book. I think for me, it just didn't work for whatever reason, and I'm very disappointed, but I still give it 3 stars because, as I said, like there is a lot to like. I did like kind of how magic was talked about in this world and how we saw magic. I liked this kind of rivalry between these two magicians that I thought was really interesting. And I did like that historical like influence on it, but I just didn't think that the book overall worked very well for me. Next, I have a book that I picked up kind of on a whim, but I was more familiar with. That's Cosmocomics by Italo Calvino. I read another Italo Calvino book earlier this year, absolutely loved it, and so I've been looking for more books of his to pick up, and this one was short and seemed interesting. In this book, we're basically following, well, it's a book of short stories, but it's kind of linked by this one character who has apparently experienced all of the events in these short stories, and all the short stories are kind of linked to space and the evolution of the universe, and each short story starts with like a little paragraph about like some actual scientific information about a subject. I'll try to find an example. So there's one story at Daybreak, and it starts with the planets of the solar system, G.P. Cooper explains, began to solidify in the darkness through the condensation of a fluid, shapeless nebula. All was cold and dark. Later, the sun began to become more concentrated until it was reduced almost to its present dimension. And in this process, the temperature rose and rose to thousands of degrees, and the sun started emitting radiations in space. And after that, we get the story of all of these characters living in the dark before there were days, and their like silly experiences during that, and before we finally get to like Daybreak and the beginning of the day-night cycle. And all these stories kind of have this link to something that actually happened, but then we go into these really like wacky but also heartwarming and fun stories. They're so fun, they're so unique. I think my favorite is actually the first one, which is talking about the moon, and in this story the moon is so close to the earth at the beginning, where these characters will row out in a rowboat and put up a ladder and climb up to the moon and collect a substance from the moon and then climb back down. And there's just a lot of like character to these stories. I think that story really encapsulates like the mood. They're very fun, but there's also some kind of melancholy energy. I don't know the best way to explain that, but there's a darkness to a lot of these stories that make them still very, very captivating to me. I think there's a lot to dig into, and I love the tone. I think the tone just really worked for me, as we had this mix of really fun and unique ideas with kind of really deep explorations of what this character is experiencing. I think just that mix really, really worked for me, because I like my stories to be weird and I like them to be dark, but I think a lot of that, the time I think about short story collections I've read, and I can't really pick out a lot of the individual short stories, like looking back on them, they don't leave a big impression on me, but this, it really had a lot of character because of that more fun and like unique ideas and like the thematic through line. And I'm just very happy I was able to read this, and I gave it like 4 stars, but I think I'll reread this at some point and it might get moved up even more, because the more I think about this, I'm just completely wowed at what he was able to do. Next, I had my second Joan Didion of the month, and that was a new one, not a reread, and that's Democracy. This is not one of her popular books at all. This was written in the 80s, and most of her books that people really love are either her earlier books, which are like 60s, 70s, or I think like her books from the 2000s, especially like Year of Magical Thinking. That's a big one, written in like 2004. But no one really talks about this. I've like never seen anyone talk about this, and I actually really enjoyed it. This is a very strange story. As like a simple outline, we're following this woman who's married to a senator, and their kind of strained relationship, and also her weird relationship with members of her family, and it's all based around this one like horrific event that we kind of learn about from the beginning, where there's like a murder involved of someone in this woman's family, and like the whole family is involved in some way, and it just creates a lot of uproar in her life and in the life of her husband, and obviously the rest of the family who isn't murdered. But after we kind of find out about that, we're kind of just building up to it. We learn about the relationship between these two characters, the relationship between her and her family. Another important part of this is we're introduced to a man that Inez, the main character, I should have just said her name earlier, is kind of has an affair with, but has like a weird relationship with as well. So there's just a lot of complicated dynamics throughout this whole book that kind of build up to the murder once again, but then also we see the aftermath of the murder and the impacts it has. A very sprawling story. We're going from Hawaii to Southeast Asia to New York, and I think California too, and we're seeing all these different lives and the political life too. The difference between the public life and the private life is definitely explored a lot in this book, especially with Inez, who is so often in the spotlight because her husband is a senator, versus like her life with her family and how that kind of comes into conflict. But also the really interesting thing about this book is that Joan Didion kind of inserts herself into the narrative. So she acts like she knows these characters. The way she talks about the story is as like she's directly involved in it almost, and she plays a part in it, like she meets Inez. So it's just a very weird narrative style that I think turns a lot of people away. So the entire story is based in like 1975 and when the US left Vietnam, and that plays a large part in everything that's happening. It's constantly referred to. There are characters directly involved in that, and it just permeates throughout all of the events in this novel. So it's a very complicated book. I don't think I did justice at explaining it. I think because it, as with Played As It Lays, there's so much going on. But I just think that what she's able to do with this book is very impressive, because she's able to weave all these parts together into a story that is still satisfying in the end, even though I don't think it completely answers every single question, and I don't think that you can really grasp everything in one read through. But I think the opening of this book is absolutely phenomenal. She writes in a very distinct way in this book. There's very short sentences, there's a lot of repetition, and I just think that the writing and the way she's able to actually build up this story is very well done, and I really enjoyed how it was able to tackle the themes of private and public life, and with the backdrop of the Vietnam War so well and so cohesively, when it feels like a lot of disparate parts when you're just talking about it without the context of the full book. So I ended up giving this 4 stars, and I really enjoyed it. Next is the best book that I read this month, and that was The True Deceiver by Tove Jansson. I might be pronouncing that wrong. This is a book that's translated from Finnish, I'm pretty sure, and I picked it up on a whim because I really liked the cover, and I really like New York Review books, like editions, and this is one of them. But at its heart, this is a winter story about these 2 women, one a little younger, one a little older, who kind of meet and form a complicated relationship. It's a relationship that slowly deteriorates, but also becomes more complicated as we progress towards the beginning of spring. To get a little deeper into that, we're basically following this village where everyone kind of knows each other, and there's lots of gossip about everyone. And this younger woman, she lives with her brother. She really loves her brother, but he's kind of seen as not really the smartest person in the world, and he works kind of as like a shipbuilder, but it's kind of on a temporary basis. It's not like he's fully employed, and he kind of just does whatever people tell him, and he's not really treated very well. And then we have this older woman who lives in this house at the top of the hill. She's wealthier than everyone else, and she makes her money through these drawings or paintings she makes for children's books. And she's kind of very solitary, and she really doesn't leave her house. So these two women, motivated by very different worldviews, kind of meet at a certain point. And from there, we have a story of deception and what it means to deceive yourself, what it means to deceive others, what that does to a relationship, and also what honesty really kind of means, because it's kind of convoluted in a lot of ways in this book. We see that play out with the rest of the village and how they interact with both of these women, but also how these women interact with each other, their motivations for doing different things. I just think it's a really simple book at its core, really not moving settings. We're in basically like two different places within the same village for like the whole book. We are following basically two characters, and we become intimately familiar with them, with how their relationship works. And I just think that we go so deep within this simple kind of story structure that it really pays off by the end. Like, I feel like this relationship is so complicated, and there's so much subtlety going on with just the way it's written and the motivations of these characters that just really worked for me. And I think the ending is kind of leaves some things open. I don't think it's the most satisfying ending in the world, but I think it's really important that it is like that, because I think it kind of is the only way you can go in a book like this, where this relationship is so complicated and these characters are so complex that a simple ending wouldn't make sense. And so it's a shorter book. I'm so glad I picked it up, and it's very atmospheric. The atmosphere is kind of used to supplement the story, and how the weather changes, how the seasons change is a really kind of all-encompassing mood that really envelops these two characters as their relationship progresses and as they become closer to each other, but also further into their own self-deceits and lies that they tell each other. As you might be able to tell by my rambling, I absolutely love this book. One of my favorites I've read this year, and I gave it 5 stars, and I would highly recommend it, although it is slower, so make sure you're okay with a slower book before you pick it up. A speed round. Otessa Moshfegh, Death in Her Hands. This was a reread for me. In this book, we follow a older woman who lives by herself with her dog. Her husband recently passed away, and she moved away from her home with him to this new place. And one day she's out on her morning walk, and she uncovers a note that says her name was Magna. Nobody will ever know who killed her. It wasn't me. Here is her dead body, but there is no dead body. And so that's the setup for this kind of pseudo-subversive murder mystery that we follow, that is really about the psyche of this woman. There's not a lot of action in this book. There's not a lot of actual like mystery solving. You basically spend the whole book just hearing this woman's thoughts, and it's a reflection of aging, obviously, but also of love, of marriage, what a marriage is, the lies we tell ourselves about the relationships that we're in to kind of make everything okay, but also the artist and the writer and what it means to create characters and to craft worlds. It feels like a very meta book in some ways, especially on reread, once you know everything that kind of happens, getting to really reflect on the thoughts that she's thinking and what they kind of mean in the broader context of the ending of the book, and what's actually going on once you know, is just really fascinating. And it feels like the author, Otessa Moshfegh, is kind of talking to you. It's a very unsettling book, as we are seeing everything through the eyes of this woman who is going through a really rough time and is kind of struggling to function properly and think logically. And so yeah, I just think that it's a very interesting book. It's a very unique book. It's a very subversive book, but it's also a very slow book. And so I don't think it's for everyone, because once again, not a lot of action. We're just in this woman's head. for 250 pages, but I think that that slow build really works for me. And even though I feel like you can kind of figure out what's going on pretty easily, pretty early on, but I really don't think that's necessarily the point. And I think having this journey with her inside her head is just fascinating, even the second time. So I would recommend this. I think this is one of my favorite Ottessa Moshfegh books, but definitely not for everyone. This is the last book I read this month, another one I picked up on a whim, and that's The Juniper Tree by Barbara Commons. This is a book that I really, really wanted to like a lot more than I did. It's based on a old Brothers Grimm fairy tale called The Juniper Tree, and like the first lines of this book are reciting that story. I will do it right now. My mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My sister, little Marlinchen, gathered together my bones, tied them in a silken handkerchief, laid them beneath the juniper tree. Quit, quit, what a beautiful bird I am. So really unsettling way to start a book. Also, that's kind of like a rewritten version of a line in the fairy tale that kind of makes it fit the story that actually happens in this book. And going into the book, I didn't really know a lot about this fairy tale. I kind of learned more about it after because I was interested in it. And this really follows a lot of the same beats of that tale, except at the end, apparently it's very subversive from that and kind of goes in a different direction, which I won't spoil because I don't want to spoil it. But to actually give you an explanation of what this book is, we're following this young single mother named Bella and her child who is mixed raced from a kind of one-night stand-ish situation, who the father doesn't know about her, but her mother loves her dearly, and they are kind of moving to this new area where she doesn't have a home, she doesn't have like a job, she doesn't really have a safety net she can fall back on. She still keeps in touch with her mother, but her mother treated her horribly as a child, and they have a really strained relationship because her mother is very bitter and very mean to her. As they move into this new town, she gets a new job and she meets this family, the Forbeses, and they form an almost familial relationship. It's this husband and wife in this huge, gorgeous house with a garden in the back, and then it's Bella and her child who are working in this antique shop. They enter into each other's lives, and the story kind of takes off from there. It's an exploration of motherhood, but also of class and race, and it's kind of a subversion of the evil stepmother story, but it does it in a very interesting way. And because I hadn't read the old fairy tale, I was shocked at some points. I was like, yeah, that might happen. And then it actually happened. I was like, that's crazy. I think that I really love this character of Bella. I think she's very well written. You end up rooting for her a lot because she's been through so much and she continues to carry on. But at the same time, she is a little passive in a lot of situations. She kind of just goes along with a lot of things where it kind of feels like she probably should have a little more agency. So I didn't really know what to think about that, but it was definitely something I noticed. And especially towards the end, this book gets pretty crazy. There's a lot going on that feels like there is build up to it, but it also feels like a lot happens really quickly, which I wasn't sure how I felt about, but I actually did think that the ideas we ended up exploring, because of the crazy things that happen that are directly related to the fairy tale, once again, I think they were explored in an interesting way, but I don't think that this book worked as well as I wanted it to work for me. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars because I still enjoyed it a lot, but I kind of just wanted more out of the ending and how we ended up getting there. I feel like the first 3/4 of the book, it's this really slow moving story where we're really building up these characters, their relationship, the kind of sad things that do happen, really add to like the atmosphere. And then as we move into that last quarter, once again, there's a lot happening really fast, and I think I would have liked it to be drawn out a little more so I could kind of care about it a little more. But I think this is a really interesting book, very unique. I really liked the idea of the fairy tale informing this book and this kind of using that as a basis to tell its own similar but kind of different story. And I would definitely recommend this hesitantly if you're okay with like this slower book, and if that fairy tale connection sounds interesting to you, I think that part is really interesting. I would just be wary because I don't think it kind of does everything it sets out to do perfectly, because I feel like the ending does feel kind of strange. Those are the 9 books I read this month. As you can see, as I said, wide range of both like ratings and types of books, but I'm actually very happy. I found a lot of books I really liked, and even the books that I didn't necessarily love, a lot of them were books I had still been wanting to get through for a while, and I'm glad I finally got to them. And I have a lot of books planned to read soon, so definitely check out my video that I'm going to make on my TBR for the upcoming month, because that will be very exciting. So please, if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe if you want. Let me know what books you read this month, which ones were your favorites, if there was any disappointments that you had like me, if you picked up anything on a whim that really stood out to you and made you want to pick up more books on a whim, because I definitely learned that that's a good thing to do this month, and sometimes buying a book for its cover is an okay thing to do. And I will see you in the next one.